Defense Secretary Mattis joined the ASEAN defense ministers meeting in the Philippines, where he indirectly challenged China's rise in the region. Does this meeting offer insight into Trump's stance when he visits Beijing next month? Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with Tai Wei, coming to you live Monday to Friday on CGTN. Defense ministers from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations held their 11th meeting in the Philippines this week. The ministers met with their counterparts from Australia, China, India, Japan, New Zealand, the Republic of Korea, Russia, and the United States. U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis told Filipino media before the meeting that ASEAN should give voice to those who want to build relations based on respect rather than economics and militaries. Media analysis show that Mattis is trying to pit ASEAN against China, as they say. Mattis' trip to Asia comes just weeks before Donald Trump's first state visit to Asia as the U.S. president. For more on Mattis' Asia trip, in our Beijing studio, we have Mr. Xiyu, who is a senior fellow at the China Institute of International Studies, here with us. Thank you, sir, for being with us. And also in Boston, we have Professor Robert Ross, professor of political science at Boston College and also associate at the John King Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies with Harvard University. Thank you, Professor. Joining us in Singapore, we have Lim Tai Wei, research fellow adjunct at the East Asian Institute of National University of Singapore. Mr. Lim, welcome as well. I want to start with you, Professor Ross, if I can. Yesterday, once more, really? United States want to pivot back to Asia again in a different name?
Well, I'm not sure what you're referring to. I read all the news reports of Secretary of Defense Mattis' visit to Asia, and the #1 item on his agenda was North Korea. And from my understanding, that's the #1 item on China's agenda as well. So there's something of a consensus there that we have a problem with North Korea. Second thing that Mattis stressed in order was the problem of terrorism in the region, ISIS in the region, collaboration with the Philippines and other countries to defeat ISIS and defeat terrorism, and he was quite pleased with Philippine success. So is there a pivot? I look at the Secretary's visit, I look at policy since the Trump administration took office, and I see a much calmer voice, a lower profile, insofar as the United States is doing what it's always been doing, that is enhancing its security in East Asia. But in contrast to the pivot to East Asia by Secretary of State Clinton, Secretary of Defense Carter, this is a calmer, more sober policy.
Calmer, more sober policy, is it the disguise for something bigger, for example, against China? Many in this part of the world have that question. Mr. Yang, here in Beijing, your thoughts?
Well, there are obviously a big gap between China's perception about U.S. policy towards China, towards Asia, and the U.S. true intention towards Asia. As our American friend Professor Ross mentioned, U.S. has done quite a low profile. But for China's perception and understanding, Trump administration remain keeping a very high profile involving Asia-Pacific affairs, especially the security affairs. You mentioned earlier what Mattis' remarks. Everyone knows who meant, although he didn't mean the name.
Even though he didn't mention the name, but we all seem to try to figure out what he exactly is trying to refer to.
We have a common understanding about what country he mean. Yeah, that's the different understanding about U.S. policy. But the fact is, the real fact is, in terms of the policy or strategy towards Asia Pacific, I don't believe Trump administration has finalized their strategy toward this region.
Okay, Mr. Lim, Singapore used to complain about the fact, or rather about your own perception of having to stand in a team, whether with the United States or China, earlier when the United States was trying to do what they consider as the pivot to Asia. Does Singapore and some of the other Southeast Asian countries now have continuously this danger and this challenge?
Okay, I agree with Professor Ross here. my understanding of Secretary Mattis' visit is based on the release printed statement on 23rd of October. And his priority was actually on having a common stance in the North Korean crisis. And he also made it and commended his Filipino counterparts on being able to rid Marawis of terrorists, and he congratulated the Filipino counterpart. As for Southeast Asia, it has always been trying to make good friends with both the US and China. Southeast Asia is heavily involved in China's Belt and Road initiative, whether it's in high-speed rail or in port infrastructure. And Singapore is also engaged in China's Belt and Road initiative through the Chongqing Connectivity Initiative. Southeast Asia and Singapore are also engaged with the US because the US has been in the region for a long time, and the countries, including Singapore and other ASEAN members, have a close relationship with the US since the end of the Second World War. So I think ASEAN or Southeast Asia is trying to be good friends and reach out to two great powers in the region because they see that they have positive contributions to the region.
Mr. Yang and also Professor Ross, I want both of you to comment about that. In the report given by Xi Jinping as the General Secretary of CPC Central Committee, he talked about territorial integrity, in fact, in many times. He also talked about the importance of security for China and also building up a modern and updated military. So, having said that, though, he also talked about, as we mentioned in the previous debate, the global community of shared future. He also talked about China's ARC project, Belt and Road initiatives with the other partners around the world. So, when you look at China, how should people reconcile the two parts of China's important strategies at the same time? Let's go to Professor Ross first, and then I'll have Mr. Yang also to come in this discussion. Professor Ross, this is relevant, particularly about China's relations with Southeast Asian countries and also the U.S.-China relations in the region.
Well, I think we should see China's role in the region and throughout Asia. The One Belt, One Road is an important initiative that can raise development throughout the region, raise standard of living, increase infrastructure. These are all good things, and this is a good initiative that China will be taking for the regional economy. And as you say, that's one element of Chinese policy. Of course, the other element, as you suggested, is U.S.-China relations and territorial issues in the South China Sea. And in fact, to defend its territorial sovereignty, China's been quite active over the last few years, perhaps even more active than the United States. It's reached agreement with Singapore to hold its first joint naval exercise, first agreement with Malaysia to hold its joint naval exercise, and of course China is carrying out island construction in the South China Sea, which President Xi Jinping referred to in his speech the other day. So these are all new initiatives in the region. The United States, of course, and other countries are going to do similar activities to promote their own security. So I think it would be a mistake to simply look at one side or the other in this relationship, and that all the countries in the region are in a dynamic here where they're all trying to increase their security, but as they do so, as you suggested, intentions and how they view the other's intentions are changing. So you suggested that Chinese views of American, Yang Xiyu suggested that Chinese views of American intentions are quite different than how America sees itself. Well, of course, you know, a similar situation exists in the United States, where Chinese understandings, American understanding of Chinese intentions is a big concern as we watch island building and growing Chinese naval presence in the region. So in addition to North Korea, the United States and China have a very important agenda item, is how to maintain cooperation, even as both sides contend for security in the region.
Mr. Yang, you want to come in on that as well?
Well, let me put the last point as the first. Obviously, there's a big ground for cooperation between U.S. and China on the North Korean issue, simply because the fast rising North Korean nuclear weapons threats are really imminent challenge both for China and the United States, even more imminent for China than the United States, because we are neighbor. And hopefully, the two leaders from the two big countries will reach some results for the further cooperation on this issue. However, on the strategic issues, like our host Qian Wei mentioned, there are indeed a sort of contradictions between the two sides on the strategic perceptions and also strategic goals. China separate our national security interests strictly from our economic cooperation projects. And just like Xi Jinping said, we have no intention to get any little more than what sovereignty coverage. But on the other hand, we really want to solve the difference on the sovereignty disputes in peaceful manner. With time going, I believe more and more countries will understand China's true intention of this controversial and sensitive issue disputes.
The other thing that we are seeing today is the balance that China needs to keep about its relationship, for example, with the DPRK and its roles on the DPRK issue, and also the issue, let's just say, in the South China Sea, because at times you have to prioritize what is more urgent, and you have to prioritize as to how much energy you would put on what issue. At this point, Mr. Yang, very briefly from you, from China's perspective, what is the priority? And how is China be able to maintain some of the basic level of the so-called the bottom line, while at the same time working on some of the most important issues? How is China spreading around its efforts and energy, Mr. Yang?
Okay, the bottom line or the red line for China is very clear and simple. Say peace and the stabilities on any controversial and conflicting issue, ranging from North Korean nuclear issue to South China Sea disputes,
right,
and any issue else, because only on the peace condition we can reach what we want. You can reach what you want, and our shared interests can be materialized.
Mr. Lim, you know, this time, Secretary Mattis' visit to the Southeast Asian countries, people put together with the previous trip made by a Secretary of State to India and talking about the role of India vis-a-vis China. Some people here see it as an overall strategy, even though it is probably at its primitive stage of the United States with this administration, its attitude toward China, meaning to use other countries in Asia to balance China out in order to seek the best interests of the United States in the region. Some of those in China see it that way. Mr. Lim, what is the best way for countries like Singapore? We know Singapore has been very smart, quote unquote, in your strategy of taking advantage of your position in the Southeast Asian countries and being a quote unquote communicator between China and the United States. But how does Singapore and Southeast Asian countries these days see its own role now, when China, of course, in a different stage, U.S. the same?
Singapore and Southeast Asia has supported all the free trade initiatives that were put forward both by China and also the existing ones and new ones by the U.S. And Singapore finds itself, together with other Southeast Asian countries, to be involved in the most important economic diplomatic initiative, now known as Belt and Road Initiative. There is a trans-Asian railway running down from Beijing all the way to Singapore. There are also high-speed railways running through Russia, connecting different parts of different islands in Indonesia. So you.
Well, we have some problem connecting to Mr. Lim in Singapore right now. Let's go to Mr. Ross. I mean, this is an important time. An important time because it is right before President Trump's visit to China, his first ever state visit, and we all know President Trump seemed to impose some kinds of unpredictability in his way of directions, particularly foreign policy. Professor Ross, how should we, with Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense words, be able to understand what President Trump would have in mind, or actually they're not related at all?
I think it's not hard to determine that President Trump's priority will be North Korea. It's been his #1 security issue since he assumed office, and remains the #1 issue in the U.S. security agenda. And we all understand that without U.S.-China cooperation on North Korea, there can be no success. There can be no cooperation with South Korea or any other country. So this is key to this summit. It's trying to reach a common ground to put more pressure on North Korea to give up its testing of both missiles and nuclear weapons. Second, of course, is the economic issue, not addressed by Secretary Mattis, understandably. He's Secretary of Defense. But that's a major issue for the American people, for jobs, for exports, for intellectual property rights. And President Trump cares deeply about that. And that'll be high in his agenda as well. Having said that, I think the other issues we might want to talk about or have spoken about, including Southeast Asia, including India, including Taiwan, believe the President's policy is no need to talk about these issues. No need to discuss these issues. America has its policies, China has its policies, and we'll pursue these quietly on our own. It's the areas that we need to focus on for cooperation that matters in the U.S.-China relationship and matters in the summit. I think that's a good strategy. Focus on cooperation. Where we differ, we can go our own ways quietly.
But the argument is, Mr. Yang, from you as well, if we cannot work on the differences, how are we going to have the confidence to work on some of the most important issues, even though we have the ultimate same goal, but the paths to reach there are very different, Mr. Yang?
Well, actually, you are touching a very tough challenge for both sides. But on this challenge, Xi Jinping has pointed out very cleverly. He said, let's try to manage and control the differences we cannot solve in short time. Meanwhile, try every effort to enhance and extend our cooperation ground. So I don't believe that two presidents can solve many fundamental differences between two countries. But I'm confident that the two sides will learn more and more to manage and control the differences we cannot solve in short term.
Right. That takes a lot of political wisdom. And for now, we have to wrap up our conversation. I'm sure that is likely to continue in the future. Thank you so much, the three of you, Yang Xiyu, Robert Ross, and Lim Tai Wei.